And we are live. Good afternoon, everybody, and to everyone in attendance today. Welcome to this collaborative event, this webinar between the Mail and Guardian as well as the South African Human Rights Commission. In case you were wondering who I am Gershwell Brooks. I'm the Communications Coordinator at the South African Human Rights Commission, and I will be serving as your moderator for today. The speaker for today is, of course, our chairperson at the South African Human Rights Commission, and that is Advocate Bongani Majola, and he will be chatting to you in the next couple of seconds. Just by way of introduction, to explain to you what this webinar is, it's an extremely innovative idea coming together between Mail and Guardian as well as the South African Human Rights Commission, where we thought that we would look at COVID-19, the current lockdown conditions, and the human rights issues that have given rise as a result of the state of national disaster that has been declared in terms of the Disaster Management Act, and how human rights have been holding up in that particular area. And of course, to take us through a little more of that is the chairperson of the South African Human Rights Commission, Advocate Bongani Majola. I just wanted to highlight the fact that this is an interactive process. So if you have logged in and you're part of this webinar, you would be able to pose questions. I would just like to also advise, or make comments even. I'd just like to advise, though, that we ask that you keep it as general as possible. This is not the platform to deal with specific issues that you may have encountered. Of course, you are welcome then to always contact the South African Human Rights Commission. All of our detail is, in fact, on our website. That is www.sahrc.org.za. But I think that's enough from me. I'm immediately handing over, of course, to Advocate Bongani Majola, who is the chairperson of the commission. And I think the first question I'd like to ask Advocate as chairperson, the biggest complexity, I think, for a lot of people dealing with lockdown conditions during this national disaster that we have as a result of COVID-19 is usually the question around how does this better serve human rights? Are we actually protecting human rights through the lockdown process? Or is this limitation of rights a simple sign of rights just being infringed upon, and that there's a closure of these particular rights, human rights that we have?
Well, thank you very much, Gershwell. I'd like just to also welcome everybody who might be watching, and to say that actually this is meant to be a discussion. This is a very new thing that we are facing as the world. We haven't faced this for a very long time. So whatever we are going to say, we will say, but we'll also be very keen to hear what people contribute to this. Of course, the measures that have been published under the Disaster Management Act impinge on some rights to an extent, and they cause inconvenience and even pain at some stage. But it is for a much bigger, greater good. The Constitutional Court, some time back in one of the cases, said that the two most important rights, and one is the right to life, the other one is the right to dignity. And all these measures are intended actually to safeguard, to protect the right to life ultimately. The right to health also will be implicated in that. So these pains that we're suffering now, I think that they will bring us greater benefits in the end if we persevere and go through them.
Well, Chair, I just wanted to use this opportunity to also point out that some of our attendees, people who are participating in the actual webinar, are just saying hi, everyone, and sending their greetings. And with that, just a reminder that everyone is encouraged to make their comments and to post their questions as we continue this conversation, this very important conversation. Chairperson, the next issue that immediately pops up for me that I think is an important issue to discuss. It's an important issue to consider, and that is also the role of the state at this point in time. Now, we've obviously, as the South African Human Rights Commission, have had to deal with numerous human rights concerns and issues, ranging all the way through from people being, seeing security forces in the form of the South African Police Service and members of the SANDF having been accused of being heavy-handed. We've also seen many other instances where in our informal communities, people, or in informal settlements, we see that people are obviously unable to comply 100% with lockdown conditions because of their living conditions. And what a lot of people have pointed to, or what the narrative has been, is that there seems to be a human rights violation by the state in this particular instance. Do we see this as a human rights violation, or are there other factors at play that we haven't taken into account?
Well, it is intended to be something that benefits the whole nation, in the sense that it is intended to stop the spread of this very deadly and virulent virus. But in implementing it, it becomes necessary to limit some of the rights that people have. I do not think, and I haven't met anybody who says that the state is just deliberately trying to trample on or violate people's rights. It's all in the give and take, in the sense that if you leave people together, there is then the greater opportunity for the virus to multiply and to transfer from one person to another, and so on. And if you're going to limit some of their rights, like the freedom of association, then you deny the chance to jump around as much as it can. Keeping people in their homes and so on is part of the pains that I think become necessary, but it is not intentional on the part of the state, I would say, to simply just want to violate people's rights. But the nature of this is that it has the effect of limiting some of the rights, and also there is an opportunity for the violation of rights, as we've seen in some cases where there have been, for example, as you mentioned earlier, police brutality. But I think that it's all in an effort to try and save the nation from a very dangerous pandemic that we have.
We've received a very interesting question I see here from Patricia Whittle, asking the following: is the institution of a curfew constitutional? And also, in terms of the regulations, the banning of tobacco products, whereas that has been overturned, because we know previously, going to stage 4 or phase 4 of the national lockdown, tobacco products were going to be, the ban on tobacco products was going to be lifted. That has been subsequently overturned. She wants to know whether this can be legally challenged. So I guess it speaks to a broader question of A, is the current conditions constitutional? And B, can some of these actually be constitutionally or legally challenged in a court of law?
Well, our constitution, let me start with the last part. Our constitution actually, coming as we did from apartheid, where sometimes we were denied the ability or the right to go to court and have our dispute settled there. Our constitution actually allows people to go to court and challenge things that they feel are violating their rights. So to answer the second question, I would say yes. It can be challenged. Anything can be challenged in court. It's up to the judges to say whether there is merit in the challenge and throw it out, or whether they will entertain it and want to hear further about it and then decide after that. So people, yes, can go to court. But as the Commission, we have looked at this very question, whether or not this is constitutional. And we think that it does comply with the requirements of the section of the Constitution that allows that rights may be limited for particular reasons if certain conditions are met. And we think that in that regard, as far as the Commission is concerned, that yes, it is constitutional. Otherwise, we actually have long challenged it ourselves. About the sale of tobacco and other things. I mean, that's a very painful one for people who are smoking, to be told all of a sudden that they may not smoke. But again, the government, Dr. Mkhize has explained again, and Dr. Professor Karim have explained that this virus attacks the respiratory system of a person. And it is known long before we had the virus that smoking also weakens the lungs. Some people even end up with cancer and so on. And so it would be very difficult to say that the measure is unreasonable and so on if the whole aim is not just to save one individual who wants to smoke as much as they want, but because of the infectiousness of the disease, that person, if that person is not cured, may infect many other people. And so in order to stop the spread of the infection, try to limit its effectiveness even on those who want to smoke.
Thank you for that, Chair. I just wanted to point out very quickly, and thank you to all the contributors, people posting questions and participating in the conversation. We've had people joining us from Cape Town, people joining us from Soweto, in essence, joining us from all over the country. And we really welcome that. And of course, thanks for the questions rolling in. There's many of them rolling in. I might not be able to get to all of them, but I'll try to get to you as many as possible. There's one from Dewa Mavinga, and apologies if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. Thank you, SAHRC and MNG, for this webinar. Are there any support interventions during lockdown that are targeting refugees and asylum seekers, for example, with food parcels, etc.? I mean, that's a big issue in terms of the rights of non-nationals during the lockdown, and this is an ongoing question that has come in, which will tie into a question that I have for you later on, Chair, around the right to work, workers' rights, especially in the lead up to Workers' Day tomorrow, being the 1st of May.
It's a very important question, particularly because at the beginning of the lockdown, we saw that certain forms of relief that were being dispensed by the state tended to be given to nationals to the exclusion of non-nationals. And we think that that is very, very wrong. Number one, the law on refugees does not permit the government to exclude the non-nationals. But besides, on sheer common sense, you can't want some people to survive and the virus and then let the other group simply just have to cope as much as it can, even if they perish. We have an obligation to do the minimum that is necessary to preserve the lives of everybody. As the Commission, we know that we're dealing with a moving target. Sometimes when we are planning to attend to certain issues, then we get relaxations and so on. But we're still concerned that access to food parcels is still based on the production of South African IDs or other documentation, when in this country we know that we've got a lot of people who are undocumented. Where do we put those people? These are unusual times to deal with a very unusual pandemic in which we actually have to try and accept any form of identification that people can give without prescribing the forms that some of the people do not have. And then we provide them with the necessary medical assistance, with food and other things, even with shelter this time. We need to provide them so that they do not go around in the streets. So yes, the Commission is monitoring this, and we've been monitoring it since the beginning of the lockdown, and we'll continue to monitor. And where it's necessary, we are going to intervene with the authorities so that the particular practices are changed.
Chair, a very interesting question came in from Kathy Hurley, and I think it speaks broadly to the human rights framework, to how Chapter 2 of the Constitution generally works, including the limitation clause being Section 36. And her question is as follows: is there a requirement for the state to demonstrate logic and evidence in limiting one of our rights?
Logic and what?
I'll repeat it very quickly. Logic and evidence in limiting one of our rights.
I would say that there is an obligation on the state to demonstrate both of them. You remember that we're coming from a system that was arbitrary, and decisions were taken without any reason why they had to be taken and implemented, even though sometimes there was no evidence that things warranted particular action. And so the current dispensation requires that decisions should be reasonable, and they should be based on the law and on the Constitution. So my answer would be yes.
Thank you for that. And coming into some of the other issues that are coming up, one of the key points that was raised by one of our participants, it was a very simple one-liner asking about the right to food. But that ultimately brings us back to a much broader issue, despite the fact that it was such a short question, and that is socioeconomic rights and the impact that we've seen on socioeconomic rights in this particular period. It might not be something that the Commission has received many complaints on, but it's something that the Commission has been working on and has been dealing with on a high level throughout this particular period, Chair. And it speaks to so many. I think let's start, for example, with the key issue to the right to food. We know a lot of people are unable to work during this time. We know that we have a lot of people who participate in the informal economy in South Africa because of lockdown conditions. They are unable to participate or make money and thereby provide food. What are some of the concerns, and what are some of the steps that we would like to see being taken during this period, especially when it comes to something as basic as the right to food?
Well, our concern has been that the state machinery has not been able to actually reach all areas and all the people that need to be reached. There are people who are still not getting adequate services in terms of providing them with food in order to sustain themselves when they are not allowed to go out and get the means of getting food on their own. So the state has an obligation then to reach all of them. The machinery has been quite slow. We are very grateful to civil society organizations and NGOs who are trying to fill a gap in that regard. We are also concerned about the way in which access to food is being shared around. I've already referred to the exclusion of people who are not nationals. We remember in the beginning, even spaza shops were closed, and when they were opened, there was assistance promised to some and not others. But the good thing, of course, is that I think that the Command Council is reviewing this on an ongoing basis and effecting changes. There is also the whole issue of corruption, which really worries us, that people can take advantage of very poor people at times like these, when all efforts and all resources should be geared towards helping those that cannot help themselves. I have not been to rural areas, but judging from the feedback that I get from there, it does appear to me that there is a greater need for the government and everybody to also focus on people who are in far-flung rural areas, because they face a lot more challenges than those that are in cities.
Indeed, and Chair, I mean, that then immediately leads us to, I think, the overarching issue then dealing with the socioeconomic disparities that we do see in South Africa. We all know that all too often South Africa is described as a country with an extremely high unemployment rate, high poverty rate, as well as the most unequal society in the world. Does the current lockdown conditions under COVID-19 give us ultimately a lens or a view into the state of human rights, particularly when we talk about socioeconomic rights and the living conditions of people in South Africa?
Well, I would say yes, you are absolutely right. But all these things have been there. We have been complaining about the whole issue of poverty and unemployment and inequality. In Magaliesburg, you remember what, 2 years ago, we raised concerns about this. We have issued the inequality report in order to highlight this. And I think what this pandemic, this unfortunate pandemic, is doing, it's now saying, well, everybody has to take a closer look at all those efforts, the quality reports and so on, so that resources are actually focused more on issues such as access to socio-economic rights. We are just 10 years away from 2030 and the SDGs. Hopefully, this is also going to spur all of us, including government, into doing a lot more in order to make sure that we leave no one behind. And that therefore socio-economic rights are given the priority that it needs. The levels of poverty in this country for many people are shocking, and yet you then find a few people who drive around in all kinds of cars, and they display their houses, their wealth, and what have you. Something needs to be done to make sure that when the Constitution says that we should be equal, that equality is not just a pipe dream, but that in terms of means of survival, everybody has got means of survival, access to healthcare, everybody has got to education, that we have housing. There are people who are still using a bucket system. There are children at schools who still have pit latrines and so on. These are all socioeconomic rights that actually we should be spending a lot more energy, into making sure that people have access to. We now only have 10 years left.
Yeah, it is a disturbing situation, an ongoing problem that that exists in South Africa. I don't only think it's something that is commentary based, where one can say that we a country with deep inequality, deep poverty, and deep unemployment. It's quite evident at this particular point in time through what we are seeing. Chairperson, another question that is cropped up on a couple of occasions I see as I'm scrolling through the questions is obviously your right to belief, opinion, as well as religion. And we know that because of lockdown conditions, because of social distancing being encouraged, many religious organizations have had to close their doors physically and literally, because of course, you can't necessarily maintain the needed social distancing. So obviously, church services have come to an end, mosques, their doors have been closed, temples, and so on and so forth. And a lot of the questions are relating to the whole issue of saying, but hang on, isn't this an infringement on my right to freedom of religion, belief, and opinion if I'm prevented from being able to go to church in the first instance, and second to that, where the state doesn't seem to be taking the voice of religion into account. What is your take on that, or that prevailing feeling coming through when it comes to the issue of religion?
Let me express my personal view on this one. My understanding of the freedom of religion, that the freedom of religion is actually part of the freedom of belief, and conscience, because it goes to what do you believe. Do you believe whether there is a God and whether there isn't a God, and so on. That's the belief. But then the practice, that many of us follow in following that belief is to go to church. We go to mosque and so on. And the question therefore arises is whether going to church is the right, or whether the belief that I have a God and I pray and I do this, whether that is the right to believe. Because there are places where, for example, you've seen where Christians, for example, in Egypt, I wouldn't say Egypt is against the Christian religion, but there are people there who burn a bus and shoot and whatever, because they don't want people to believe in Jesus Christ, because they believe in the Prophet Muhammad. That in my view, that is then the denial of the freedom of religion. But whether or not going to church is a violation of the right to freedom of religion is a question. I would rather see it as an issue relating to the freedom of association, the right to freedom of association. That what is being limited is the ability of Christians or of Muslims or of Jews, and the ability to or the freedom to come together, and worship or do what other things. That's where I think the effect of this limitation is it stops people from associating, and as a result, people who are associating for a particular purpose of praying then feel vulnerable. But it applies to everybody who wants to associate.
Chairperson, a brilliant question came up earlier on in relation to the role that the Commission has to play in advising the state and government, especially when having to take such drastic steps, especially when having to make such drastic decisions like the lockdown in terms of the National Disaster Act. And the key question is, what role does the Commission then play in advising the state or government under those particular circumstances? And how do we better strengthen that ability of the Commission to then inform the human rights lens when coming up with drastic measures such as these?
Well, the legislation governing the South African Human Rights Commission actually provides, I think in Section 13, that we have got an obligation to advise the state whenever we think that certain action would be beneficial towards the promotion of human rights. We are obliged to advise that. We unfortunately were not consulted by the government when they decided on the lockdown, but I mean that's what happened. But the role that we have is actually to look at some of the things that have been made part of the regulations. Yesterday, for example, one of the amendments related to a situation where parents were not allowed to go and fetch their children, especially across provincial borders. We were busy preparing something that we wanted to send to the government as part of our obligation to advise the state of the problem with that particular dispensation, but it was changed, and so I think it has now become moot. So we have to advise the state, and we will monitor and advise the state on an ongoing basis about things. And the form of advice that we give to the state, sometimes we advise the state directly by writing to the state, but also we issue media statements in which we say this is wrong, so that then we kill two birds with one stone. On the one hand, we tell government that it is not in accordance with human rights. On the other hand, we tell the public also, because we have got the obligation to educate the public about their rights, to promote also a culture of human rights, and so that serves the two purposes.
Chair, I'm just quickly pointing out also to our participants that there is actually a poll running as we're having this particular discussion. I'll quickly read the questions as well as obviously the responses and the numbers that we've gotten through. I'm not too sure how many people have participated in the poll thus far, but the numbers are panning out very interestingly. The poll question is, do you trust the police, military, or state authorities when it comes to protecting human rights during COVID-19? And thus far, 10% of the respondents are saying yes, an overwhelming 64% are saying no, and 25% in turn are saying not sure. So that makes for interesting reading there. And perhaps, Chair, I will, closer to the end of our discussion, come back to that particular poll and just ask your view on what that says about people's thinking and view, and then what should we do to guard against absolute and perhaps unwanted sense of cynicism, where people just give up completely, because obviously that is also not encouraged in itself. Coming back to some of the other key issues that has come up on a regular basis is a question around eviction. It seems to be a major concern, and Michelle, I believe, points out here saying, greetings, what about the people who have been evicted from their homes by the Red Ants? This after the president and ministers have said none should be evicted from their homes during this particular point in time. I mean, that's a very important point as well, the issue relating to eviction, the right to housing, and especially under these very difficult circumstances where it would be virtually impossible for most people to be able to get alternative accommodation without flouting the regulations in place.
Well, this question actually is one of the issues that one can say surfaces very clearly from this pandemic, namely that everybody has got a right of access to housing, and that right has actually to be realized by the state, which has an obligation to fulfill it under Section 7.2 of the Water Code. So the reason that you get people running around occupying land and what have you, it actually tells you that there is something where there is still a lot of work that the government needs to do after 26 years in order to provide people with accommodation. I do know, yes, and I agree with the government that they have built 4 million houses, but I mean, that number should not be a static number which cannot be recycled every now and again. There has to be greater step by the government in order to provide people with accommodation, with housing, with shelter, things like those. So we as the Commission, of course, we have taken steps against evictions in Cape Town and elsewhere. We have taken steps against eviction in Gauteng, in Lowly, and what have you, and we have gone on to say to the municipalities that it is wrong and that they should not do it, and so on. And so we feel, therefore, in fact, we were surprised. I was surprised to see the red ends. But we feel that there should not be evictions at this time. Because of the nature of what we're trying to do, we're trying to keep people in one place. They shouldn't move around and so on. And evictions creates that wave of people having to move from one place to another. and therefore the potential to defeat the aim of these measures. And so it should not happen. Secondly, of course, people should not use the opportunity of the rule that says don't do evictions, and then they go and occupy other people's land. You know, that's what the governments, that's what the municipalities are saying. They are saying, but this land was not occupied when the lockdown started. And so people then came in to do that. We have rights as a nation, but we also have responsibilities. People should therefore not go to a situation that makes it difficult for us to defend them, to say, listen, this should not happen. You know, if you were not there at the start of the lockdown, don't go there and then cry wolf after that. Of course, we will protect you because still we believe that you should not be evicted.
Chairperson, as you very well know, right at the onset of the lockdown implementation, we had a very disturbing statistic that I think reached us within that very first week of 87,000 cases of domestic violence having been reported in some shape or the other. And Wendy Isaac, to that point, asks an extremely important question, saying, greetings and thanks for this webinar. I have a question on the impact of the extreme lockdown measures on women and girls living with abusive male partners. We have heard of reports of security forces stopping women who attempt to escape abusive households. Since legal services are not considered essential services, what is the SAHRC approach to providing essential services and support to women living under these conditions?
Well, it's a very big pity that, you know, at this stage of our democracy, that there is still so much gender-based violence, and there's so much violence against our children. Of course, the Human Rights Commission is against this and condemns the violence against women and girls and children in general. We monitor it. We are saying that those who break the law, because this is a violation of the law, the South African police services actually should have no mercy against them. They should be arrested and prosecuted to the full extent of the law, so that this stops. The issue of gender violence is an issue that is also the concern of the Commission for Gender Equality. And they also are spending a lot of energy in dealing with this very particular issue. And so the South African Human Rights Commission plays a supporting role. That was the question, what is your... We play a particular supporting role in the bigger picture of what needs strategically to be done in order to eliminate this form of abuse of women and children in our society. My sense is that the COVID-19 actually says that we have to work much closer together, the CRL, the Commission for Gender Equality, South African Human Rights Commission, and others, in order to try and promote a culture that respects human rights of people.
In Essentia, Mgijima raises an important one, saying, thank you, SHRC and MNG, for this engagement. Is the Commission monitoring the situation of persons in institutions, be it mental health institutions or old age homes? There is evidence from other countries of high infection and death rates in institutions. And I take that would also translate to many other places that we've seen, including institutions of detention, whether those be police cells, whether those be correctional facilities, that there is a concern where you have to house people in close proximity and in large numbers. There's a high possibility of infection, number one, and number two, are the necessary steps being taken. Is that something that the Commission is monitoring?
Absolutely, we are monitoring that. One of the things that we're trying to do, because of the nature of the lockdown, which limits the ability of the what we call the commission to physically visit places, some of the places, especially those that are far away. We are trying to find innovative ways in which we monitor that. But yes, we do monitor, especially places where people are held against their will. We have a team, the NPM, that actually monitors those people, those places where the people are held, people with mental problems, police stations, correctional services. For example, places like the Strandfontein camp, where the homeless people were rounded up and kept where they were kept. We are monitoring that, and we actually got a multi-skilled team to look at that, and they went and they've just produced a report on Strandfontein, exactly because of our appreciation of the fact that if we do not monitor those places, a lot of things will go wrong. The issue of excuse me, the issue of crowding is a very big and troublesome issue, because schools are going to open, and we're going to face how we're going to deal with that issue. We have also dealt with the issue of people who are living in informal settlements, because there's also incredible overcrowding in those areas. So it is a very troubling issue. My sense is that it's one of those issues that Chapter 9 institutions, the Human Rights Commission in particular, need to engage much more closely with government. But monitoring, yes, we are monitoring. We may not be able to monitor everywhere and every institution, but we are having to monitor and then to intervene where it is possible.
Indeed, and you touched on it very briefly there, Chairperson, on the issue of education. I mean, it's a major concern, considering that we do understand that some schools, for example, have provided online learning facilities during this particular lockdown period, because we know that children are at home with their parents, and whether it be a work from home or live from home scenario for them, and some of them have access to the internet and can use online learning facilities, but for the vast majority, this is not a possibility. So I think it comes as a welcome reprieve that we know that plans are in place, and I think that the two ministers of education later on today will give us a briefing around the staggered return to school for learners. But what would you like to see as the South African Human Rights Commission, as the chairperson of the South African Human Rights Commission, during the return to school? Obviously, to facilitate and to enable the right to education, but while simultaneously taking into account that we have a serious concern and a serious issue in the form of COVID-19 being an extremely virulent virus that's easily spread, and communicable virus that's easily spread amongst people.
Well, as the Commission, we actually talked a little bit about this. It's a very important but very major problem as to what is going to happen while the children are staying at home and not going to school, even though some are studying through digital means. I come from a very far away rural area, and when I ask people there about what's happening, some of them don't even have a Vodacom signal to get there. Even if they get laptops, they will not be able to, to utilize that. So yes, on the one hand, one would like to see education going on, but one would like to actually also see how what is the plan that the two departments are going to come up with, because it is very important that while kids go back to study, they are also protected from the infection by COVID-19. We know that the infrastructure of schools is not sufficient. In rural areas, the schools are very small, and you find a class that was built for 50 learners having 100 plus learners, and so there is overcrowding there, and the day still has got a finite number of hours, and so even when you stagger the classes, maybe it may not accommodate the what you call the schools of themselves have to be sanitized. There has to be greater hygiene. Our concern is we're going to open schools when some of the schools don't have access to water, and we are saying that everybody must wash their hands with soap on a regular basis. We're talking about social distancing and so on, and it's not very clear how this is going to happen. So what I would like to see is a real concrete plan that takes all these into consideration and then puts in place measures that aim at mitigating these risks. With regard to schools for children with disabilities, it is a question how those schools are going to open, because we are not supposed to touch, but especially those that are blind, the only way of navigating is to touch. And so how are we going to deal with situations such as those? I think that on the one hand, I'm excited that schools will open. On the other hand, I'm very concerned that the opening of schools may be opening another avenue for the spread of the pandemic, unless we actually take very careful steps. Thank you.
Chairperson, I just want to quickly highlight to the participants and everyone viewing us live at this stage that, of course, the poll is going to close pretty soon. I just want to ask you, Chair, to keep in mind that to our poll question, do you trust the police, military, or state authorities when it comes to protecting human rights during COVID-19, that 11% have said yes, 61% have said no, and 27% have said that they are not sure. So that poll will close very soon, and we'll go back and reflect on the results of that particular poll, in terms of what it informs us around our discussion. Just very quickly, and I'm going to, use my powers as the moderator and reflect back on the fact, and this ties in with the fact that if you look at the webinar page, on the right-hand side, there's a segment for offers. If you click on that, you will notice the Commission's contact details there with the Commission's website. You click on that, it will redirect you to our website. And also, for people that are looking at the logo, you will notice that we are celebrating 25 years this year. It's our 25th anniversary in this year, 2020, at the South African Human Rights Commission. Of course, Chairperson, this is the first time that the Commission, in its 25 years of existence, would have had to deal with a situation like this, let alone the fact that this is the first time in democratic South Africa that we have to deal with lockdown conditions and the circumstances. I mean, if you just very briefly can reflect for us on whether, a 25-year-old organization would have been ready for these current circumstances, and what are some of the other challenges that we haven't even touched on, outside of COVID-19 that we deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Your question was a little bit long. Perhaps can you summarize it again? Sorry for that.
What I'm just getting at, Chairperson, is outside of COVID-19. That is the major concern, obviously, and that is why we're having this conversation today. Yeah. But what are some of the major issues that the Commission deals with that we haven't even touched on in this particular conversation? Some of the things that people need to keep in mind that is important for the Commission to deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Well, there are many issues that we have to deal with. I think the whole issue of lack of or inadequate access of people to socio-economic rights and the inequality that we see and that the whole world is seeing are some of the what do you call the challenges that the Commission has to see. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because it's going to be very difficult to actually build a culture of human rights when we do not practice it, when some people would have and others would not have. They could go to school, their children would go to school, and others' children can't go to school for a number of reasons, access to healthcare and so on. So we as the Commission believe that there needs to be a review of the way in which resources in the country are applied to the needs of the country. And COVID-19 has actually shown us that if we had spent more money on housing, then we wouldn't be forcing people into this number of people into the Strandfonteins and so on. The access to healthcare and so on. Those are some of the issues. But the whole issue of human rights, many governments, and in fact the United Nations have now acknowledged, and the South African government as part of the African Union have acknowledged that actually, if you want development, you cannot do development without adopting and embracing human rights. They're what I call, but the action has to now catch up with that decision. In other words, to spend more money and time and energy on the whole issue of human rights. There is a need, for example, for us to get the space within which we can engage government and say, in our view, this would be much more conducive to the promotion of human rights, and get somebody who engages us and shows us why it won't, or who agrees and then agrees also to the implementation of that. That is still a concern for us in South Africa. At provincial level, there is the whole issue of the municipal governments that are reported every time we have the board meetings. They are reported as not being cooperative. At provincial level, we've got snippets of cooperation here and there. At national level, we also have snippets of cooperation. We do not have carpet cooperation at all these levels that would enable us to to promote human rights. I often have said to government ministers that I've met that the people that they are serving as elected representatives of the people are the very same people that the Commission is trying to help. And so, since we have got people that we both are very eager to protect and we are very jealous about, that we should work more together in order to achieve what those people who put them in power actually anticipated they would get by doing so.
Chair, we have approximately, and for everyone participating, we have approximately 6 minutes left. I have two very brief questions, and hopefully we can get through them very quickly. I think first and foremost, I'm looking at some of the questions that we're receiving, as part of our chat facility here, and then a lot of them doesn't deal with what the South African Human Rights Commission actually, what our core work is ultimately. And Chair, I'm just going to ask you to remind everyone participating in this poll that obviously, and in this webinar in particular, what the core function of the South African Human Rights Commission is in the form of our mandate, and that obviously there's many other organs throughout the state, scattered throughout the state, as well as civil society that has a role to play in other spaces. I'm looking at, for example, people asking questions about assistance for their businesses during this particular period. Surely that falls outside of the Commission's mandate, unfortunately.
Well, the mandate of the Commission actually is to promote human rights, coming as we do from the apartheid system, which survived on the violation of human rights. We are to try to push back the tide by promoting. And promotion means telling people about their rights in many settings, including on the media and so on. But also promoting human rights when there are violations or threats of violations, when we come out and say, well, if you continue doing this, it will violate somebody's rights, or you already violated that. We promote also the rights by issuing statements and pamphlets and things. But because in the process of living our lives, we get our rights violated, or we violate rights of other people. The Commission's mandate is also to assist in protecting those rights, and largely we protect the rights by getting to the violator and telling them that they are violating the right and that they should stop doing that, or in certain circumstances we also even then get redress for the person whose right has been violated, and that redress ranges. It could even include going to court in order to ensure that the right is actually protected. People who are asking for assistance when they are not getting loans or other things, I mean, we can only come in if there is an indication that they are being discriminated because of particular reasons on the grounds that are mentioned in the Constitution. Otherwise, it is really not our function. I must add also that sometimes people see things being done wrong, and then they say, why is the Commission not doing something? You could have prevented that. Ours is actually to monitor also and to point out and to report. Section 7(2) of the Constitution says it is the state that must protect these rights and fulfill them. So the state must actually do the actual protection of these rights.
Chairperson, in the final 3 minutes that we have left in this webinar, and I just want to ask you very briefly, what is your response to the results that have come through on our poll? Do you trust the police, military, or state authorities when it comes to protecting human rights during COVID-19? 11% have said yes, 61% have said no, and 27% have said not sure. Very briefly, what is your take on that level of response from our participants here?
Well, it is. I mean, I'm not surprised that people still have the level of distrust. I personally trust them. I think that many of them are actually doing a good job. We issued a statement recently in which we actually pointed out that actually it's the majority of them are doing an honest job, and that is just a few bad apples that are damaging the name of the police and the whatever. But it also then goes to point out what remains of the police authorities and the government to do in order to remove this mistrust. Because the very few that I'm talking about, they do such bad things, and then you get very little feedback from the top echelons saying that this should not be done under our command, and this is what you get if you do this. So there is also a lack of proper supervision. Right now, people who are violating the lockdown measures by being on the street, they can be arrested, and if they pay a fine, they pay a fine. But you find people who have the money to pay the fine being told, no, you've got to appear before the magistrate and stay in jail over a long weekend and what have you. People get beaten up and so on. That is what the top echelon of government has to work on and say, listen, we can't live this way, because we now earn only 11% of people that trust us when we are actually doing a very good job protecting everybody.
Well, thank you so much, Chairperson. I mean, that brings us to the end of this webinar. Thank you for all the participants. Wonderful questions posed. And really, we appreciate the participation and, more importantly, the interest in human rights. Of course, there are other webinars that the Mail and Guardian will be hosting. From what I can see here, the page for that is mg.co.za/webinars/. As for the South African Human Rights Commission, you know where to get a hold of us, www.sahrc.org.za. All of our information is there at provincial level, at provincial office level, for any complaints that you need to provide us with, whether it be COVID-19 related or anything else. And we thank you for your participation, your attendance, the wonderful questions posed, participation in the polls as well. And we wish you all the best, and all the best for tomorrow being Workers' Day, the 1st of May.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Joshua.